Welcome back to another edition of the 6Ps podcast, and today we're going to be focusing on language, structure, and style, and the way that the authors use these to tell their respective stories. So we're going to provide you with a bit of a snapshot of all these elements today. As a bit of an overview, this is what I would label that next level analysis, where you're not simply focusing on what is in the story, but more so on how it's told. So we can have a look at things like language choices. We can look at the style, the way the story is told, the text type, the perspective, even the genre, and the structure, the way the events in the texts are sequenced and the reasons behind that. So let's start with the basics. So obviously the Crucible is a play, therefore it's meant to be performed to an audience. It is linear. There are 4 acts with 4 settings, and the events are in chronological order. Now there are stage directions and authorial intrusions or interjections or commentary used, along with dialogue as a way to tell the story, and quite often I think students can sometimes skip the stage directions in their commentary, and I think they're really important to include because Miller does this on purpose, and he does it because this is an allegorical play. He is making a comment on 1950s American society and linking it to what was happening in 1692 Salem. In contrast, The Dressmaker is a novel. It is predominantly linear, but there are some flashbacks, the most pertinent one, of course, when Tilly recalls the events that happened between her and Stuart Peterman that led to his death. It is third-person perspective. It is omniscient, though, so while it is third person, we still get the character's thoughts and feelings. And I've said this before, but it's that neo-feminist lens that this story is told through. While the Crucible is allegorical, the Dressmaker is more satirical. And there are elements of dark humour in this text. And they're interspersed with those moments of grief and suffering that we see primarily through our protagonist, Tilly. So when we look at structure, both texts are made up of 4 parts. So with the Crucible, Act 1 is in the Paris household, we move to the Proctor house, then the courtroom, and finally the jail. Notice how we go from more private spaces into public spaces, and we know that the witch trials were used by the Salemites to air their grievances, that all the dirty laundry, so to speak, was made public. This is what condemned characters. Such as, for example, Martha Corey. It was the fact that Giles, unfortunately, couldn't say his prayers because she was reading that ended up being used in court to condemn her or make her indictable. The Dressmaker is also 4 parts. So gingham, shantung, felt, and brocade. So we move from more functional elements of clothing or fabrics to the more opulent and luxurious. Again, it sort of follows Tilly's return back to her hometown of Dungatar. So let's have a look at the language that's used. We'll start with Miller, who uses biblical and religious references to emphasize the idea that Salem as a setting is very much Puritan and religious. The quotation I like to use a lot because it's so flexible is actually in Act 2 when the Proctors are discussing Abigail's newfound power within the community due to the role that she's playing in the witch trials. And they say, where she walks, the crowd will part like the sea of Israel. Abigail here is Moses, pretty much. She's leading the people to freedom and salvation. It's really a nice simile to use. You'll also notice there's lots of old-fashioned dialect. You all picked up a couple of weeks ago the phrase I that's used a lot rather than yes. The pacing and hysteria I've also mentioned here, particularly at the end of Act 1. You'll find that the girls, particularly their hysteria, is captured by the wording that Miller uses, and it's so quick in its tempo as well. With the Dressmaker, the Australian vernacular or Australian slang terms comes to the fore here, and in fact the language that the characters use, a little bit similar to the Crucible, I guess, with Titubar, but the way the characters speak reflects their social status. So Elspeth particularly, the way that she speaks is meant to be more articulate and more formal. And we see that Trudy tries to pick up on this. In fact, they try and change the name of the town from Dungatar, yes, where dung is the most prominent syllable, to Doongatar. So even they try to class up the community. What is interesting is you compare that to Mona, who particularly in chapter 2, when she talks, it's in that really harsh Australian dialect. Similes and metaphors are also used by Ham throughout the text. I think particularly ones that relate to animals, especially when she's describing the townspeople. And I like this one early on where it's from page 42. Down below, the people bob together like chooks pecking at vegetable scraps, turning occasionally to glance up at the house on the hill before turning hurriedly away. And referencing the townspeople as chooks sort of leads us to believe that they lack intelligence and that they form this sort of mob mentality, this pack mentality. And the fact that they are always looking up at the hill suggests that they are frightened or fearful of what is happening between the Dunnages. Let's quickly talk about the style as well. The Crucible is really explicit. What do I mean by that? Well, the character descriptions, which are highlighted through the commentary and stage directions, are really, really clear. The very first page, we know that Paris is a bad man. He has a vindictive nature. Not much good can be said for him. This all comes up on page 1, so immediately as an audience, we're against him. Yeah? Unlike John Proctor, for example, who is a bit more complex, but he has strong morals. That is outlined in his commentary that Miller uses, and that's done on purpose. We formulate opinions on characters before we meet them, and Miller is really driving the audience's reactions. This also is an allegorical play, a text. So we've been through this before in class, I know, but just quickly, Miller is trying to suggest, or he's suggesting that what is happening in 1950s America, this fear of communism, is exactly what is happening or happened in 1692 Salem, where there was a fear of witchcraft, a fear of the unknown, and that people are persecuted based on hearsay and rumour and innuendo and not concrete evidence. And Miller is subtly trying to condemn the American government, particularly Senator McCarthy, who was really eager to persecute people based on hearsay. With the dressmaker, it's a bit more implicit, and clothing is used to introduce characters rather than descriptions. We have gone through this in class, I know, but it is important to make note of the clothing that each of the characters wears, particularly Tilly, but also little things like you'll notice that Beulah at the ball wears a green gown. Green, of course, is a colour of envy. We know that from Rear Window and Miss Lonely Hearts, but pick up on these things because you might find that not many others do. It is a third-person perspective, it is omniscient, I've said that before, and it is satirical. And of course, we did Animal Farm in Year 10, but satire and humour is really important in this text in the way that it's sort of told. And what Ham is trying to do is to showcase that this is just a microcosm of society, that this could be any rural community in Australia. Dungatar is not alone in the way that characters behave, particularly leaders and women. It doesn't matter where in Australia you are, this is a common theme throughout, that it's widespread. So, irony is also something that connects the two texts quite nicely. Again, I know I've been through this before, but I'll briefly mention this again. The dramatic irony in the Crucible comes up throughout. So John Proctor, of course, and I know so obvious, but Hale in Act 2 asks him to recite the Ten Commandments. Of course, what one can't he recite? It's the one he's guilty of, which is adultery. Elizabeth Proctor. Also, we see the irony here. She's called to the court after John confesses that he had been with Abigail, and Elizabeth will verify it, he says. And he does that because she's never lied in her life. Of course, the one time Elizabeth lies, and she does so to protect her husband, unfortunately, that condemns him. Abigail, who, as John Proctor calls, a whore's vengeance, through her testimony, ultimately becomes a whore. She ends up in Boston as a prostitute. And then we've got this nice irony about Paris and Salem. Look at the quote from Act 1. He, like the rest of Salem, never conceived that children were anything but thankful for being permitted to walk straight, eyes slightly lowered, arms at the sides, and mouths shut until bidden to speak. Why is that ironic? Well, Judge Danforth says in Act 3 that the entire contention of the state in these trials is that the voice of heaven is speaking through these children. So Salem doesn't believe that children should be allowed to speak, yet in Act 3 it suggested that they're the only one. Their voice of heaven speaks through them, that they take their words as testimony and they use that to persecute the townspeople. The dressmaker similarly is also littered with irony. We've got Mr. Almanac, who did not believe in drugs, yet he was the town pharmacist. And it's ironic because his death comes about because of the drugs or the herbs that Tilly provides Irma. Beulah, who has bloodshot beige eyes that bulge, she's always snooping around, she's always looking in on people, ultimately becomes blind. Elspeth says that the town doesn't agree with her, yet in the end the fire burns down everything except her house. It's also ironic because she doesn't accept Gertrude or Trudy even though she herself is a farmer's daughter. And we've got Pettyman and the town of Dungatar. The fact that the women turned their backs when they saw him. What I like about this is the fact that the women turn a blind eye to Evan Pettyman and his ways, yet they're so quick to torment Tilly and Molly, even though Evan is the one to blame in terms of that behaviour. I think it's really interesting and you can definitely comment on that. And even Evan Pettyman and the fact that he is made impotent by Marigold, by herbs provided to him by his wife, even though he, of course, is adulterous and has that affair with Una Pleasance, as well as the other women in the town, of course. All right, let's have a look now at some symbols from both texts. So with the Crucible, the first one to think about is paper and how this represents authority. Notice too that John Proctor tears up the paper and crumbles it. In fact, the quote is tearing the paper and crumpling it. This represents his rebellious nature and the fact that he refuses to conform, and I really like that. The paper, of course, also could link to Reverend Hale, who arrives in Salem with books, and these, of course, are weighted. The crucible is a nice metaphor as well. Obviously, it's the title of the text. Crucibles, let's get all chemistry again, shall we? It's used to heat and test the point on which metals melt. And of course, this is symbolic of the town of Salem during the trials. It also separates what is pure and impure, and I really like that to describe John Proctor himself. The forest, obviously, it's beyond the bounds and the rules of Salem, and in this sense as well, it's where they believe the devil lived, so there was much fear involved with the forest. And the last one is the puppet, which represents innocence. Yet this puppet in this case, which is used to condemn Elizabeth Proctor, and it ends up twisting the town's innocence to an extent. In the dressmaker, we've got clothing, and we've been through this a lot, but obviously clothing is used to represent status as well as an individual's identity, or to cover people's true identities up as well, which is what Tilly does. The fire is the next symbol I've been looking at. It's quite cleansing but also destructive, and we see that at the start that fire is cleansing for Tilly as she starts a fire up at the house, but it's also quite destructive and it destroys the town at the end. Fire also links in nicely not just to the crucible in terms of that idea of a crucible, but also when Judge Danforth says, "We burn a hot fire here, it melts down all concealment." I really like that connection, even that there's fires within fires in this town. There are references in the Crucible to fire, which I really like. Again, that destructive nature of things. It's also interesting because it also can represent warmth, and that's what's lacking in the Proctor's relationship. Elizabeth Proctor admits to keeping a cold house. The garden, of course, and Tilly's knowledge of herbs. Again, linking nicely in with nature here too, with the forest. But Tilly obviously uses herbs to help the other women in the town. And there's also a link to witchcraft, that knowledge of herbs and plants, which is historically, women having this knowledge is often historically linked to witchcraft. The last symbol or motif I should say, is Macbeth. So we did Macbeth last year, of course, in year 11, so you know it very, very well. It is, of course, a cursed play, and ironically, the town ends up imploding through the performance of Macbeth. Notice too that there's a nice link between Lady Macbeth and Trudy. Both are really ambitious women who use their husbands to gain power or class, but ultimately they end up descending into madness. Going back to the idea of witchcraft as well, I can see a real clear representation of Tilly as the witches in Macbeth. She sort of manipulates the townspeople and manipulates ultimately their downfall through this. The names is something else to look at, particularly in the dressmaker, and it's done on purpose. So I'll run through a few of these. This is not the exhaustive list. There are more than this, but just to go through them. So Tilly and her shift from Myrtle into Tilly, and the idea that Myrtle was who she was before, and because of the curse, she says on page 191, "My name is Myrtle and I'm still Myrtle." She can't shake that curse. How the town label her. Also note that dunnage is material used to protect cargo on a ship as well, and I think that works really nicely with Tilly. Gertrude too changes her name from Gertrude to Trudy to form a more elitist identity, but again, we know that it's all on the surface. Deep down, she'll always be, as Elspeth calls her, a stupid grocer's girl. I love that quote. Teddy McSwiney, yes, swine, pigs, and poverty. You might suggest though that pigs are quite clean though, as animals, generally speaking. So maybe that might have something to do with the fact that Teddy's a really good person, and so is May, because of course May helps Molly and runs up food to her. Una Pleasance is really obvious. She's unpleasant. Evan Pettyman is a petty man. Marigold, you could say. Evan, of course, married her for her money, but marigold is also used to poison Evan at the end. That's, of course, a plant. Percival Almanac, he knows everything. He has all the information of all the town. Beulah Harradine is a harridan, a harsh, conniving woman. And the Dims, yes, they are quite dim people. Of course, there's that reference that Miss Dim, that Prudence Dim, taught the children of Dungatar for as long as anyone could remember. That reflects the idea that Dungatar is stuck in the past. There's not much progress. They're quite rigid. It's also interesting to note that it is Ruth Dim that doesn't insure the town, and that leads at the very end of the play, of course, with the fire, they don't have any insurance. Again, that was partly Ruth's fault. They used the money instead to fund their play of Macbeth and to pay off Tilly, which is quite ironic again. Again, that's not all the characters' names you could look at. I think they might be worth referencing from time to time. Again, some of them are quite obvious, but if you find something in that and it works well, then go for it. That links us nicely into this idea of writing and how to include these elements into your writing. So do think about it where possible. I think they make, again, that really nice next level analysis, something to add on to evidence in terms of exploring and analysing the texts. Think about authorial intent. This is really important. Of course, we looked at this with Rear Window and Alfred Hitchcock and what he does through his film techniques. Well, this is sort of similar. Why do the authors include these language features, the stylistic features? Why have they structured the texts in this way? And remember those verbs, and again, they're plastered up on the wall above the whiteboard, but those verbs like condemns, critiques, and promotes. So Miller condemns or Miller critiques 1950s American society, or Ham promotes the idea of female independence. So this is a sample paragraph. It's only half a paragraph, actually. It's based on the Crucible. What I'd like you to do is have a read through it and highlight for me where language, style, and structure is referenced. So how did you go? I've highlighted what I think is the area where language or stylistic features are referenced. So as to bring this idea to the forefront, Miller continually uses the motif of dancing to reflect the absurdity of both the Salem and McCarthy trials. In comparing the girls' act of dancing to those of heathens in the forest, Paris immediately associates dancing with ritual and conjuring of spirits, as the term heathen invokes connotation of rebellion and evilness. Comparing this with the girl's extreme fear of being whipped for dancing, Miller magnifies the degree of severity of this purported crime and oppressive nature of the Puritan society, thereby condemning the overly strict and repressive society of Salem. So the symbol or motif that's used here is dancing, and you'll see those analytical phrases used. The verb associates, the verb magnifies, the verb condemns. They're all used not just to outline the motif, but also to explain how and, of course, the why it is used by Arthur Miller. And again, thinking about those verbs, condemns, critiques, promotes, suggests, all work really, really well, emphasises. All right, so the key takeouts from today are firstly to think about that next level analysis. Today, I just provided you with a bit of a snapshot, a very brief overview of the language, stylistic, and structural features of both texts, but you might want to go into more depth and detail about these, or perhaps find your own examples. With that, it's really important that you build your knowledge of these and link it to the key themes and ideas. Try and think about evidence or examples that are flexible, that cover a range of themes and ideas, or ones that are quite unique. Again, examiners were really impressed when we read things we haven't read before, especially if they're articulated really nicely. And that leads us on to our next point, which is to embed it into your writing where possible. This is a challenge quite often because sometimes we find that when we bring in these pieces of evidence, it's a little bit clunky, it's not as fluent, but if you keep practicing your writing and attaining feedback from your teachers, you're going to find this a lot easier. Again, reflect on your writing, on what works and what doesn't work.